Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's lunch break, which is focused on gun violence in Michigan. Our featured panelists are Bridge, Michigan reporters Isabel Lohman, Jonathan Oosting, and Stella Yu. Today's conversation will be moderated by Bridge Managing Editor Joel Kurth. Just a note, before we get to our program today, I do want to acknowledge the pain that many of us are feeling regarding the tragedy at Michigan State University. Our hearts are with the families of those who were killed and injured and all those that have been traumatized by this violence. This is a lot for all of us to process, and I will share a link in the chat to a list of resources if you are struggling. Our conversation will begin in just a moment, and Joel will lead the discussion with our panel for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, but he's the moderator, I'll let him be in control. And then we'll turn to your questions. A lot of you pre-submitted some questions, so we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. But if you have questions that you think of throughout today's conversation, please type those directly into the chat window. Please do not unmute unless you're a panelist today. We'd like everyone to stay muted throughout the discussion, but I'll be collecting those responses from chat, as will my colleague Rebecca, and we'll make sure that Joel has those to talk to the panel. As you heard at the beginning of today's discussion, we are recording. We'll be posting this recording on Bridge Michigan's website, bridgemi.com, and also on our YouTube channel. Bridge Michigan's coverage of gun violence is supported by the Joyce Foundation. Events like this one are also made possible by the support of Bridge members. If you'd like to join our membership community, which is anyone who's donated any amount to Bridge in the last year, we'll drop a link to do so in the chat today. A reminder again to please stay muted throughout the conversation. I'll now pass things over to Joel to get us started.
Well, thanks so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us on this beautiful Michigan morning for a very somber topic. We're about a month away now from the tragedy at MSU, in which 3 students and 5 others were, 3 students were killed and 5 others were wounded by a gunman. Isabel Lohman covers MSU and colleges for Bridge, Michigan, and there's been some developments today. Isabel, I'm wondering if you can fill us in on those.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. So we this morning learned a little bit more information about the shooting. First, MSU police released a timeline of the events on February 13th. We know when the first shots were fired. We know when officers responded. We know when the first emergency alerts to students came out. And we also now know approximately some other details related to timing. So we have a story on that, and I'm happy to share that with you. We also now have the note that the suspected gunman wrote the night or the day before the shooting. In it, he repeatedly says that people hurt him. He doesn't say who these people are. He claims to be a loner, and he also lists several places where he said that he had accomplices that were going to do shootings as well. Police have said they believe he acted alone, though.
Did anything that we learned today change the contours of what we know so far, or change the narrative of the story, Isabel?
Not majorly. We at Bridge still have a lot of questions about what happened between the first shots being reported at 8:18 and the first alert going out at about 8:30 or 8:31 to students. Based on this timeline, we believe that the gunman entered the MSU Union at 8:24. So between the first shots being fired and when students got their first alert. So we want to know more about the timing of that alert, exactly how that alert was sent out, and truly what happened in about those 10 or so minutes between the first shots fired and when the alert came out to students.
Okay, thank you so much. What is MSU doing in terms of security changes, and what about other institutes of higher learning?
Right. So Michigan State University is starting to implement changes coming this Monday when students return from spring break. So previously, doors had been locked, as in you had to have a key card during certain hours of the night from approximately 11 o'clock at night to about 7 o'clock in the morning. That's now going to change, I believe, to about 6 o'clock to 7:30 in the morning. So there's going to be extended hours of building restriction. They're also saying they want to add more cameras, and they're saying by the fall, they want locks on all of their 1,300 classroom doors. They're also saying they are thinking about other security measures, and we hope to have more information about what exactly an expansion of cameras look like in the near future. As for other schools, our reporter Mike Wilkinson sent out a survey to public and private community, college, and universities all across Michigan, And while we didn't have everyone respond, we had over 20 people, 20 different schools respond. And in that, we found a lot of commonalities. Some places are able to remotely lock all doors from one location. MSU says it was able to do that for some, but not all locations. We know that schools, generally speaking, have cameras. And we know that schools are talking about if they should make mandatory a violent intruder training, which is something MSU plans to do in the fall, making it mandatory.
Thank you so much. Before we get too far down the line, I want to turn to Jonathan Oosting, one of our Capitol reporters. Unfortunately, what happened in MSU that day, as tragic as it was, is a symptom of a larger problem, a larger issue in Michigan, of course, which is gun violence. Can you give us an overview about the state of gun violence in Michigan? Set the table. How many guns are there in Michigan? How many deaths are there? How's that compare?
Sure. Well, to the first question, in terms of how many guns there are, nobody really knows. We don't have a exact count on that. We do know that since the year 2000, there have been about 14 million background checks performed for gun purchases for people in Michigan. Of course, we have about 10 million people in the state, so you can do the math there. As of earlier this year, there were about almost 800,000 concealed pistol permits issued in the state. So a fairly large number there as well. And that's up from about 450,000 a decade ago. So those numbers have risen quite a bit. As far as violence, obviously MSU and of course the Oxford High School shooting in late 2021 are a couple really high profile mass shootings in the state. But, depending on how you calculate or define a mass shooting, there's been several others in Michigan that haven't necessarily gotten the same attention. There's a group called the Gun Violence Archive. It's a nonprofit, and they define a mass shooting as any shooting in which 4 or more people are injured. And by their count in 2022 alone, there were 25 of those larger shootings in Michigan, including 11 in Detroit, a shooting in Kalamazoo at a party where 9 people at least were injured or killed. These things happen on a larger scale and maybe don't get the same attention all the time. As far as, other statistics, I'm going to just read these because it's sort of dense numbers, but we do know that in 2020, so it's the most recent data set we could get from the National Center for Health Statistics, there are about 1,400 or exactly 1,454 firearm deaths in the state in the year 2020. That's about 15 people out of every 100,000 residents killed by gunfire that year. That's right around the national average, actually, but it's lower than some of our neighbors in Ohio and Indiana. That said, not all of these are murders, like we saw at Michigan State or Oxford. About 6 in 10 of those deaths were suicides. So, people using guns to kill themselves is actually more common than using guns to kill other people.
And yeah, again, as comparison, I think we're looking at about 1,100 car crash deaths a year in Michigan. So obviously, gun violence is a pervasive problem in Michigan, and there's no easy answers. Are there, Stella? What has the research shown on strategies and policies and more about gun violence, particularly as we're related and focusing now on mass shootings?
Yeah, so Michigan lawmakers, Michigan Democrats have been advocating for 3 main legislative packages over the years, and we hear a lot about these in national discourse as well. There are universal background checks, red flag laws, which are extreme risk protection orders, and also safe storage laws, which mainly are used to protect or prevent children from accessing guns in their households. And so, long story short, research hasn't been, conclusive on the effect of these laws. And the reason I say that is because, like, for example, universal background check, which just cleared the Michigan House, right? Generally, research or like studies have shown that they are useful in terms of reducing suicides, homicides, but there really is no consensus, or there is generally a lack of studies on the effect on mass shootings. They generally show that it can help reduce homicides, but some scholars disagree on how well they work. And we see the same theme with safe storage laws and child access prevention laws as well, and red flag laws. For example, a 2000 study showed that child access laws only helped significantly reduce unintentional firearm deaths in Florida. But the same study also examined 14 other states and didn't show promising results. And so it is really hard to say, whether these laws work on reducing firearm related deaths or injuries in general, let alone mass shootings.
Thank you so much. I'm going to change topics, change the show slightly here, turn back to Jonathan. Talk about what happened on Wednesday. The House did pass universal background checks. Can you tell us what that means exactly?
Yeah, so currently in Michigan, for pistol purchases, you have to go through a background check. So if you do it at a federally licensed firearm dealer, they run you through the FBI database. If you purchase from a private seller, you're supposed to first get what's called a purchase permit from your local police, and they would put you through a state database. Both of those FBI and state databases kind of work similarly. They're going to check for, criminal records that might preclude you from having laws. And there's also some mental health checks there, but they're not super robust. Basically, if you were involuntarily committed and there's a record of that, or there's a court order at some point that you were mentally infirm or debilitated in some way, you might be prevented from passing that background check to buy a gun. So the loophole, as critics call it, is that for long gun purchases from a private seller, so somebody who's not federally licensed. So by long gun, I mean rifles or shotguns generally. For those bought from a private seller, there is no background check requirement currently. So you can buy those from someone in a parking lot or another, unlicensed seller without going through that purchase permit process. The legislation that cleared the House Wednesday would close that loophole, essentially require a purchase permit for those long gun sales as well. There's some debate, even the sponsors, I think the legislation was modified at the last minute, and there's some question over whether this would also extend sort of registration rules to those long guns. Currently for pistols, after you buy them, the purchaser is supposed to then send the record of that purchase to the local police or sheriff, basically to register the pistol. The legislation would change that so that the seller instead would be the one to do that for pistols. It's kind of confusing whether it would also require that for long guns. I've read the legislation, it doesn't appear so, but one of the spokespersons for Democrats said it would require that. So I'm still trying to sort that out. But regardless to say, generally it would treat long gun sales the same as are currently requirements for pistols.
Thank you for that. And just to make sure we're all on the same page here, that has cleared the House. It's going to go to the Senate next week, and we think it could go to Governor Whitmer for her signature soon after, or?
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts with gun legislation right now in Lansing. So the House has its own bills for those sort of three categories Stella mentioned. The Senate has their own version of those bills. They're pretty similar, but they're also, working independently with hearings and modifying bills in different ways. So, it might not be next week. It's hard to say. They're still fine tuning the bills in each chamber. But yes, theoretically, things could move that quickly. The Senate hasn't said yet exactly when they're going to take up bills on the floor, but did move out their own package from committee yesterday. So their version of those three gun packages are on the floor. Now, I will note too, just another thing, House Speaker Joe Tate has said these bills are the floor and not the ceiling of potential gun reforms in Lansing this year. These bills have been talked about long before the MSU shooting, so they're not a direct response to that. They're sort of bills that Democrats had been working on for several years, but couldn't advance because they didn't have control in Lansing. There could be other stuff coming up too. Joe Tate, the speaker, he said he's open to an assault rifle ban in Michigan, for instance. So we'll see whether there's any action on that front, but just to point out that there are larger discussions still about other steps Democrats may or may not want to take.
Okay, terrific. Again, this is not the first mass shooting in Michigan. About a year ago, we had the tragedy at Oxford High School, Isabel. What are other Michigan schools doing to keep campuses secure? That can include the hardening of high schools.
Right. So you are right, of course, that there was the Oxford shooting back in 2021, and some of the same people that have been advocating for change since the Oxford shooting are also testifying in the House and the Senate about these bills. And they're trying to remind people that in their eyes, this could have been prevented because of things that we learned after Oxford. So generally speaking, K-12 schools, they're required to have active shooter drills 3 times a year. They also have been upping their security in the last few years. The legislature put a lot of money in the last budget cycle to offer schools the option to increase their security. So some things you're seeing, though, they're not necessarily universal. You're seeing vestibules. So instead of when you walk in a school, you walk in the door and you're immediately in the hallway, there's some gap where there's a door, a secure area, and then another door that you get to go through after you've been checked by the office. So that's one thing. We're seeing ALICE training, which deals with like the training of making sure that we know what the threats are, that students know what to do in situations like that sort of thing. And then there's some other things. There are schools that have security cameras, some that are thinking about the AI technology where you're always monitoring the security cameras for weapons, that sort of thing. But it sort of differs depending on the school and what the schools have chosen they want to do. Another consideration is they don't want these to feel like, superintendents have said they don't want this to feel like prison. So they're trying to balance both the security mindset while also making sure school still feels like school.
And we've had a recent story, I think, from Ted Roloffs that examined some of those psychological impacts. I mean, it seems like it's a real delicate balance. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's definitely a delicate balance, and we're seeing that at the MSU students too. So I've talked to several students at MSU, and then of course talked to superintendents pretty regularly. And there's this balance of wanting to be safe, but also not feeling like they're in a prison or anything like that. So making sure that students feel like they are safe without putting a bunch of barriers in the way to make sure that they can still feel like they're in school. So Ted has some really good reporting in there about what we know related to the mental health challenges that some people face when they see a lot of this sort of hardening of schools. And that's definitely something we're still interested in. On the MSU side, for example, I talked with the student body president the other day, and they talked about how they want to make sure that they're being responsive to the fact that not everyone's going to feel safe with more people with uniforms on campus. So what does that look like? One idea is a university ambassador program. The details are still kind of fuzzy, but the idea would be you could go to a trusted student or a liaison versus the police if you see a threat or some other thing that you see as suspicious.
And also, we reported this week, I believe, also that there's $100 million that could be coming toward Michigan universities and colleges that could be used to harden schools and add door locks and capability of locking doors from the inside, which, as we've seen, was not available at Michigan State. So it seems like there's a two-pronged approach, right? There's hardening and this gun reforms, the red flag laws, safe storage, and background checks. Is there more to know about that approach, Stella? What kind of gun related policy there could be, and the likelihood of their being effective?
Yeah, for sure. So we've already seen Democrats introduce, right, as Jonathan mentioned, the floor of gun reform, and I mean, they have pushed forward the red flag laws, which is already in place in 19 states and DC, and what it would do is to allow family members and law enforcement officers to petition the court. So instead of acting on them on their own, they would have to petition the court, and a judge can decide, are there enough warning signs to warrant, a law enforcement officer to temporarily seize the gun from someone? And we've seen high enforcement rate in Florida, Illinois, California. So we're seeing both Republican or conservative and liberal states passing this law. Notably, Florida passed this law after the 2018 Parkland shooting. And Florida happens to be the one that enforces it at a highest rate. In some states, in touching upon this a little bit, just for context, in some states, red flag laws have been used, or like only law enforcement officers can petition the court to do that. Whereas in some states like Colorado right now, they're trying to expand the number of petitioners, the scope of petitioners who can ask the court to issue a what they call an extreme risk protection order, which is basically a red flag. And so we're seeing different degree of enforcement, but Michigan is hoping to allow both families and law enforcement officers to be able to do that. And another one, just a little bit more about safe storage laws. People call safe storage laws, and people use safe storage and child access prevention kind of interchangeably, but they're actually different things. So child access prevention laws are those that aim at preventing children from accessing guns, whereas safe storage laws are those that require gun owners to secure their weapons from children, as well as other members of the family, or outsiders who might not be able to be qualified to hold a gun. And so there's that as well. And beyond that, I mean, we've seen some Democrats who have pushed for banning guns at polling places. Some Republicans have raised concerns that if anybody who happens to carry a gun just happens to come in the vicinity of a polling place, what would that do? And so that legislation is also moving through the pipeline, or hasn't moved at all. And so, another thing I forgot to mention is on the safe storage piece, to encourage or to incentivize people, to be able to secure their guns. There's actually this sales tax exemption or tax credit, however you might call it, on devices that can help you secure your guns. And so that's in the legislation that's been proposed by Democrats as well.
Yeah, I don't know, that measure, sort of the carrot as opposed to the stick, actually got one of the few measures I got bipartisan support in the Senate committee yesterday. Republicans agreed with the tax break for
Yeah, one thing about the red flag laws, I believe the Associated Press last year did a study on that and found that the laws have been used about 15,000 times since 2020, which would be about 10 per 100,000 adults. And it seems as though, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like there could be a lot of subjectivity in that process. Ultimately, you're having a judge make a decision whether or not to remove it. You have to have a family member willing to take that extraordinary step of going to a judge. Are there other states, Stella, that are looking at other gun-related legislation that may be a little bit bolder than Michigan?
That's an interesting question. I can't talk about how they're hoping to expand their red flag laws to make it more, I guess, to make sure to encourage people to use it more. It is, yeah, like Joel mentioned, I mean, it is very interesting to look at the look at the disparity in how these states enforce these laws. And we've talked a little bit about the scope, right? In Colorado, they're hoping to expand the scope to allow more petitioners, like licensed physicians, for example, or educators who come in to who regularly interact with someone, or who treats someone for a mental health disability or something like that. So some states are looking at that, and in other states, I know that Florida, for example, a few years back, they had this this promotion campaign to sort of encourage local agencies to broadcast or to add to promote the use of red flag laws, to basically tell petitioners, hey, it is here if you have a loved one that you believe is posing a risk to themselves or other people. Here is a measure that you can use, because experts believe that a main obstacle to the use of red flag laws is how little people know about that. So I have seen other states trying to, put on an education campaign to try to educate people more about that. And I wanted to also touch upon the subjectivity in this. I mean, it is fascinating, because in Colorado, for example, and we're working on a story about this, in Colorado, there are more than half of the state's counties have declared themselves as Second Amendment sanctuary counties, which means that their sheriffs are more, reluctant to ask their law enforcement officers to enforce the law. And the idea is, similar to how our AG chooses to prosecute or not prosecute certain, people for crimes or, for laws that are on the books. I mean, it's similar to that concept. These sheriffs can basically just say, hey, we're not going to issue as many orders. So in Colorado, you're seeing Denver's police department, they are basically number one in terms of enforcement rate, whereas in other counties like El Paso County, where Colorado Springs is, you don't see as much enforcement. And so that's a really interesting comparison, and when politics comes into play as well. So
without getting too much into the weeds too, Joel, on the subjectivity question, I mean, even in Michigan right now, as lawmakers are crafting their version of the red flag laws, there's debate over like what level of evidence a judge, what standard of evidence a judge should apply. Is it a preponderance of evidence that the person could do harm to themselves or others, or clear and convincing evidence, et cetera? So there's, different gradations there in terms of, what standard of evidence might be required for these red flag laws in different states, and lawmakers right now are having those very debates.
For sure. And we do have a question related to that coming in from Jeff. And it was one that I was curious about too, is that you don't want to be the person who petitions somebody, your uncle, to have a red flag, to have the gun taken away, and then the judge denied it. How upset would your uncle be at you? Is there any data, Stella or Jonathan, about the negative consequences of red flags laws? If you red flag people and people find out, have there been repercussions?
Yeah, I haven't personally seen that, but that's a great point, Jeff. I think that's an area worth exploring. I did talk to a guy in Hawaii, and you may already know this, but the Associated Press analysis in September 2022 showed that Hawaii is dead last in terms of the use of red flag laws. I mean, in the entire state, there was just one case of using that. And I talked to the Firearms Coalition, which is a pro Second Amendment organization, and I talked to them yesterday. And basically, he, in a very graphic fashion, he described what could have happened if someone who didn't believe that they had done anything wrong get their door kicked open, by a SWAT team that's come to claim their guns. So there is this notion from people who share their concern that there is no due process involved, that they believe that if a police officer believes that you pose a risk, they can basically come take your guns away. And that's why it is so controversial. But yeah, no, in terms of studies, I haven't read studies that show the repercussion of these people who get accused. But in some states, and including Hawaii, there is this section in their state law that says if you falsely make an accusation of someone in terms of red flag, then you face a misdemeanor or even felony.
Interesting. Well, we have a lot of reader questions. I want to get to a couple points about MSU, and then we're going to turn it over to reader questions. Getting back to Isabel, we haven't heard from you in a while. What are you learning about the students at MSU right now, and their optimism or pessimism about making a difference?
Yeah, so I've been talking to students, of course, pre-shooting, but a lot more students after the shooting. And there's sort of a couple different threads right now. So students are on spring break right now. They came back to school a week after the shooting, and they had classes for 2 weeks and then went on spring break. So students at the time when school was still in session had been advocating for more security measures, which we've already talked about. They were also advocating for some academic flexibility. MSU has said that they're going to do a credit, no credit option, which can help preserve your GPA. That's one thing. MSU has said that they want professors to be flexible and to give students grace in this time. But the students I've talked to, several of them have said their professors have been super understanding, but their friends' professors haven't been. So there's a little bit of that tension between what's happening on the mass level versus the granular level. And then students have been showing up. So it's a huge campus, as we know. There's about 50,000 students, but we saw several hundred students turn out to the Capitol the Monday they returned to campus. They were calling for the passage of these gun laws. They were also advocating at the time for more security because we hadn't had that announcement with the more security announcements. And we were also hearing from some students who say, I'm ready for a routine. And some students who are saying, I'm still really traumatized and I need more time. So we have a story coming out shortly about student activism, sort of some of the students that have been leading the charge. We also have a group of students that have been meeting with lawmakers. We have a group of students who is holding a rally. And then this Monday, so in a couple of days, we expect students to hold a walkout at 2:13, which is, of course, 2:13 p.m. lines up with February 13th, the day of the shooting. And the idea is that it's not supposed to be political. I've talked to the organizers. The idea is to just memorialize the students they lost, as well as let students another opportunity to sort of share their experiences. So we're seeing a lot of different avenues of student activity and activism. It's unclear exactly what will happen next.
And what do you know what they want specifically?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that they wanted was a comprehensive police report, and now we're seeing the timeline. I think there's still a lot of questions we want answered. Another thing is additional academic flexibility, which it seems like that's sort of in the works. I think a lot of students have questions still about the timing of those alerts. When they got that first alert, they're now learning more information about how much happened before they got that alert. And then on the security side, they held a town hall the week that they were back. That first week they were back. And one of the things they talked about was classroom locks. Another thing they talked about was making sure that buildings were restricted after hours, which we saw, but some students want more. And then more cameras, more police presence. Although while there are plenty of people who want that, there are also some students who say too much will make it feel different.
Right, for sure. And again, the note today was released from the alleged shooter. And that did Jonathan give an insight into his state of mind. We've talked a lot about guns. I think what people on the Republican side of the aisle will ask about is mental health. I do believe it would be tough for anyone to read that note and not know that there was a lot, the individual who committed the shooting had a lot of mental health problems. Is that a part of the equation in Michigan? And if so, what's being done and what could be done?
Well, it's a very complicated question, of course. I don't have the answer right now. Democrats have certainly said that they agree that's part of the equation. We haven't seen new legislation introduced on that front as of yet. We have seen, though, Republicans take up the House had a mental health task force and passed some bills in recent years. So there have been attempts to reform some mental health policies in the state over the past few years, generally in response to mass shootings as well. Unclear yet whether those have or are going to be effective. But yeah, I mean, I would note, as I mentioned earlier, the current background check process through both the state and the FBI for gun purchases does include a very cursory mental health check. And Anthony McRae is the name of the suspected shooter at MSU. He passed those background checks to get the 2 pistols that he had on him at Michigan State. So, while he clearly from this note had a lot going on, if he wasn't, committed or et cetera, there was no, paper trail precluding him from having a gun. That said, supporters of the red flag legislation going through right now, for instance, say, well, his dad has said he thought his dad has offered some conflicting accounts of whether he thought his son had mental health issues, but theoretically, his dad could have requested law enforcement officers to confiscate his son's guns before this happened. We don't know if that's the case, but supporters certainly say, it would be a tool for situations like this where mental health issues do exist.
Right. I think
one other thing to add to that is the last legislature, which was controlled by the Republicans, and of course Governor Whitmer signed it, the last school aid budget had a significant investment in mental health. And when you look at the last 5 years, that increase it's been a huge increase. So on the K-12 level, we're also seeing more investment on mental health.
But I'm sure the opponents would say that's followed decades of disinvestment in health in Michigan. Gotta start somewhere, I suppose. I think part of the frustration for a lot of folks I'm seeing it in the meeting chat is that, Jonathan, you mentioned 14 million background checks in guns right now.
That's like over the last since 2020, so
years in a state of 10 million.
Or since 2000, I believe. Sorry, a long span. Yeah,
sure. I mean, I think what I'm getting at though is that the Pandora's box is open, even if the guns are out there, right? And even if these laws are passed, I think there's a lot of frustration that it will be hard to get rid of them. We're having a lot of questions about assault weapons, and some people are. I think what I'm hearing is a lot of frustration that it's nice to talk about red flag, it's nice to talk about universal background checks. But let's talk about AR-15s and high capacity magazines. Are we seeing anything along those lines in terms of legislation, or hearing anything in terms of legislation in Michigan about that? And let's be honest, what sort of fight would that provoke? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, we say at the federal level that it's a very big fight, right? But as of now, we haven't seen those bills introduced in Michigan. But as I mentioned earlier, House Speaker Joe Tate has said he's open to having those discussions, and discussions about other gun reforms are happening. There was some interesting polling that came out this week from the Glenn Gariff group. They're one of the best pollsters in the state. They polled on that very question and found that a majority, not a huge majority, but about 55% of Michigan voters would support an assault rifle ban in the state. And there was also majority support for banning high capacity ammunition magazines. A lot of questions about how a state would do that as opposed to a federal policy. And I'm sure those conversations are ongoing, but we haven't seen any bills yet or any details about what lawmakers might be thinking about on that front.
Stella, take this one. We have a question regarding why the MSU shooter, he had a gun offense a few years back. Can you talk a little bit about what that was and what led him to being able to legally possess a handgun?
Yeah, sure. So in 2019, basically there was an encounter with the police. The police found him, it was early in the morning. It was like 2 a.m., 3 a.m. And the police found him sitting on the back stairs and then asked him, "What are you doing here? Do you have a weapon on you?" And he did have a weapon on him, and he did have a gun, and he identified the gun to the police, and the police took that and then confiscated it because he did not have a concealed carry permit at the time. And he told the police at the time, "Hey, I'm working on it." And so, we had requested, for any applications from the shooter, the alleged shooter, but we, our public records requests were denied on the grounds of privacy. But basically, yeah, he was initially charged with a felony of carrying a gun without a carry permit, and that was in 2019. But then, since his slate was clean, he didn't have, gun-related offense before, he eventually was allowed to plead down to a misdemeanor. But the difference there is if he had been convicted of that felony that he was initially charged with, then he would be barred from legally owning a gun because of that record. But since he pleaded down to a misdemeanor, he was again allowed to legally possess a gun. And so there's no indication whether the guns he allegedly used in the shooting were bought before that 2019 offense or after that 2019 offense. The police haven't told us anything about that. But yeah, I mean, we've talked to the prosecutor who was a prosecutor in then in 2019 when McRae pleaded down, and she defended her office's decision, arguing that to her points, plea deals like this are extremely normal for first-time offenders, especially that they didn't really have a previous record. And so, yeah, but, a lot of people seized onto that point and said, this is a decision that would have made a difference that you will have to, be ashamed of your entire life. And so, yeah, we're seeing a lot of controversy over that. And last time I talked to Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin during a town hall event, I asked her whether she would consider, amending the law and kind of restricting, prosecutors' ability to do something about this and to address this problem. And she said she would consider legislation. I just don't know if she was talking about the federal level or the state level, but she said she would consider legislation that would could have, made a difference, could have
Right.
addressed that. So yeah.
We sort of always see that push and pull too in public policy, the unintended consequences. I do believe the same prosecutor, Carol Simeon, in 2021 issued a policy saying that she would not limit the use of felony firearm charges that were added on in the commission of other crimes because they disproportionately affect African Americans, which is true. But I think part of the unintended consequence is that sometimes people who are charged with those crimes go on to commit other heinous crimes, and then the pendulum sort of swings back and forth. So again, it's not an easy question. I see we have a lot of constitutional scholars in the.
Hey, Joel, just to clarify that comment, your timeline, 2021 was the policy.
Right.
McRae was in 2019. So he was not,
for sure. I was just making a larger
decision to strike a plea deal with him.
I was making a larger point today.
A result of that policy.
Yeah. I was making a larger point there about decisions to issue charges and how policies mete it out. Let's go back to reader questions. A question from Lawrence. Does anyone know if there's any discussions among Michigan legislators to pass Donna's Law? It's a voluntary self-registry prohibition to gun sales for those who choose to create self-defense against suicide. We should know too that as much attention is paid to firearm deaths, suicide is a huge problem in Michigan with firearms, especially as we get to more rural areas. Anyone want to take that on? Anyone heard about Donna's Law?
No, I haven't heard that introduced yet in Michigan, but as I noted, at the outset, the gun statistics for 2020, 6 out of every 10 gun deaths in Michigan was a result of suicide. And certainly there's been a lot of discussion about that in the legislature right now, particularly in regards to the red flag legislation. Someone else could even there was a therapist who submitted testimony saying she wants the ability to be able to, flag somebody who shouldn't have a gun because they might be suicidal. So certainly part of the discussion right now, that question about how to address what is a very large problem, but I haven't heard any specific talk about that piece of legislation.
Isabel, where do we see this going? What do you think?
It's a large question, Joel. I mean, I have been so the House and the Senate have held hearings this week and then the week before, and I've been at every one or watched every one in completion. And there are a lot of really strong emotions. As you can imagine, people who have been victims of gun violence, you've had a loved one who's died by suicide, that sort of thing. There's been a lot of that. We've also seen a lot of prosecutors and law enforcement speak generally in support of these packages of bills. Jonathan and Stella would be able to tell you exactly what the political ramifications of all of this is. I think when we think about MSU and we think about Oxford, and I continue to talk to students and student activists who've been testifying in these hearings, there's a sense that they know they're not alone. They know there have been many other school shootings. There's also the sense that they are still students, right? And they still have classes and school and family and friends and all these other things that you're thinking about when you're 16 or 21 or 22. And I think we will see what happens out of MSU, but just as importantly, you mentioned that $100 million earlier for school safety on the higher ed level. We have to see what lawmakers and what institutions are going to do if they're going to take this shooting and use it as another example why they need more money to fortify security, or if it's going to be part of this broader discussion, like we said, about the legislation.
Correct. Thank you. What about Jonathan and Stella? Do you have any thoughts about the contours of the debate?
I actually, what Isabel said makes me, think of a chat I had with students, which is quite interesting. The students who have been on the forefront of this, fight for legislative reform, or, this fight to be heard by either the media or, the school, some of them are, reluctant. They told me that they're really reluctant when they appear in the public because they don't want to be used, and I'm using their words, they don't want to be used as this used to make a political speech. They told me that at the end of the day, they want to see actual reforms of policies that could actually save more lives, but they don't want to kind of be inserted into this, partisan debate that is happening in Lansing, where we're seeing more Republican versus Democrat kind of dynamic, right, on gun legislation, except for the one that Jonathan mentioned has bipartisan support when it comes to tax credits for safety devices. And so I just think that that's an interesting point made by students who are both traumatized and who are also advocating for legislative changes.
Jonathan, any thoughts?
I mean, I just go back to what I said early on, that this seems to be the beginning of a discussion. Democrats, of course, have taken control of the legislature just in January. So they're running through bills that they'd already been working on for a while and having broader conversations about what to do beyond that. So, I mean, I think they will pass these bills in some form, get them to the governor's desk here fairly soon. Whether or not there are changes made and exactly the nuances is going to be very interesting. For instance, the Senate committee yesterday tweaked their safe storage bill to also remove some legislation that provides legal immunity to gun manufacturers and sellers so that they could be sued if guns are used in the commission of crime in some way. I do not yet know the ramifications of that, or whether the House will agree, or whether that language will even remain in the final package of the bills. But there's a whole lot of discussions going on right now. I'll also note, just like, I'm a political reporter. I've obviously gotten into the policy here a bit, but from a political perspective, Democrats have just 2-seat majorities in both chambers. Those are quite narrow. And there's a realistic possibility hanging out there that 2 House members could win mayoral elections later this year, 2 Democrats, and those seats would be temporarily vacant, meaning by this fall, Democrats might temporarily lose their majority in the House. So they're trying to move very fast right now. That's why I think part of the reason you're seeing a real flurry of activity here. They're moving. I don't know in terms of the number of bills they've passed, whether they're at the record pace, but the substance of the bills they're passing right now, certainly I can't remember anything like it since I've been covering the legislature in this condensed of a period to see this much activity on major legislation. So all that to say, things are going to move fairly quickly, but there are larger discussions out there as well.
Sure.
Yeah. I wanted to add like one last thought, which is, from the people I've talked to, either scholars or officials who have been in these states where red flag laws in particular have been around for a while. Like, for example, I talked to the Denver Police Department, and basically what they have said is there is no consensus and there is no good measure to tell how well these laws have worked. And one of them said, there is no tell when you take away someone's gun what they could have done instead. And so I would just keep that in mind whenever we write stories about or read stories about, the impact of red flag laws. Just know that the scholars haven't reached consensus on one measure to pinpoint exactly how these laws work. I mean, these are complex questions. And so, but I wish that they could be answered in a rather simple way. So
we're nearing the end. I just want to, close by saying, you're all pros and you've done a hell of a job covering this tragedy and the politics of it. I just wonder if you guys could shed a little light at all, if you care to. I'm going completely off script about what sort of toll this takes on you as individuals and not just reporters, having to cover the whiplash from not just this tragedy, but then a lot of political rhetoric around it. You can choose to answer it or not.
I can start. I think it's no secret that I'm young. I'm one of the youngest people on staff. I'm 25. I graduated from college 3 years ago. So a lot of the MSU students are pretty close in age to me. And that was something that, as horrible as the fact is true, I was really thankful that I was the one on the ground days following the shooting, because I felt like I could talk to students and say, I'm about your age. I can relate to you. I haven't experienced this, but I do want to hear your story. And you have every right to say no if you want to say no. So I felt grateful that so many students have talked to me. It is a lot. I think one of the rhetorics that we've heard is like, whether or not you agree that the bills currently discussed in the legislature would have stopped what happened in MSU, it is a fact that Democrats were working on this for years before what happened at MSU. And so whether you choose to think that what happened at MSU should mean more urgency in passing these bills, or you believe that these bills shouldn't be law, either side of that, I think you have to remember that this is a bigger discussion than just what is happening at MSU. And then I think the last thing I would add on that is that I continue to talk to a lot of these students, and a lot of these students are going through a lot. Like, I think that's the basic understanding of what is happening, but you have to remember these are very young people who are going through something they didn't think they'd have to go through. They might have been physically prepared and that they knew how to run, hide, and fight, but that doesn't mean that, the trauma from 4 hours listening to this police scanners, that's not done yet. And we have to continue to remember that when we're talking to students and we're listening to students, that there was 50,000 people who had a really severe reaction to what happened that night.
Yeah, the politics of it I can handle. I cover politics all the time. I don't cover crime that often, and being based in Lansing, like a lot of Capitol reporters here, I did help cover the MSU shooting. I went to graduate school at MSU. I live 4 miles away from it, from the university. It's a big part of my life, like a lot of people in this area, and it was really hard. It still is. The morning I did not have the job to go to the campus the night of the shooting. Our colleague Ron French did that. I would have been terrified to do it. The morning after I was there, though, at 8 a.m. covering a press conference, my hands were shaking. I was trying not to cry. I watched crews in hazmat suits clean blood off the sidewalk of the MSU Union, where I spent a lot of time in school. It's really difficult. So it's not something I'm used to. It was pretty traumatic, no doubt about it.
I do thank you guys a lot, as for the professionalism you've had today, but also covering this horrific event. And I think not a lot of people appreciate the media as much as they should. Of course, I'm biased on that issue. So I'm going to turn it back over to Amber. Thank you so much for this hour, everyone. It's been great. We really appreciate you being part of our community.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for participating today. I just want to give a special thank you to Isabel, Jonathan, Stella, and Joel for participating in today and what is a difficult topic. I also want to thank everyone who came and participated today as members of the audience. I want to specifically say that I really appreciate how thoughtful the dialogue was in the chat today. It can be this is an emotional topic, and though not everyone agreed, I appreciated that everyone was so respectful to one another. So thank you. Just a reminder, we are recording today's discussion. It will be posted on our website either today or early next week. So if you want to rewatch the recording or want to share with those who may have missed this event, you can find it on our website, bridgemi.com, very soon, and also on our YouTube channel. We will be resuming our lunch break events. We do these monthly in April. Announcement of both the date and the topic of that event will be coming soon. Thank you so much. Have a great day and stay warm all. Take care.